Stalin on the front lines, fact or fiction? Uncovering the Soviet leaders' 1941 battlefield visits. You've probably heard the narrative. Joseph Stalin, the iron-fisted leader of the Soviet Union, was too scared to leave his Moscow office during World War II, right? That's what some folks want you to believe, especially since the 1980s when historians started rethinking the Soviet story. But hold up, there's evidence that Stalin didn't just sit behind a desk. He actually made multiple trips to the front lines during the darkest days of 1941, when Nazi Germany was steamrolling through Soviet territory. In this deep dive, I'm going to walk you through 4 of these trips, backed by eyewitness accounts from Stalin's security team, rare documents, and a sprinkle of my own analysis. Plus, I'll throw in some economic insights to show you just how high the stakes were. Why does this matter? Because these trips challenge everything you thought you knew about Stalin. Was he a coward, or was he a leader willing to face danger to rally his people? And what do these trips tell us about the Soviet Union's fight for survival? I'm going to make this story come alive with vivid details, economic breakdowns, and some big-picture thoughts to keep you glued to every word. So, let's hit the road literally and explore Stalin's wartime adventures. Ready? Let's go! The big picture, 1941, and the Soviet struggle to get why Stalin's frontline trips were such a big deal. Let's set the scene. It's 1941, and the Soviet Union is in deep trouble. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June, and by midsummer, Hitler's armies had overrun huge chunks of Soviet land, think modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. The Red Army was getting hammered, losing millions of soldiers, and morale was in the gutter. In Moscow, panic was brewing. People whispered that the capital might fall any day. Economically, the Soviet Union was on its knees. The Nazis had captured or destroyed about 40% of the USSR's industrial capacity by late 1941, according to historian Mark Harrison. Factories, mines, and farms were either gone or under enemy control. The Soviets were scrambling to move entire industries, think massive steel plants and tank factories thousands of miles east to places like the Ural Mountains. Data from the Russian state archives shows over 1,500 major factories were relocated in 1941 alone, but many weren't back online yet. This meant the Red Army was short on tanks, guns, and even boots for soldiers. In this chaos, keeping the country's spirits up was just as crucial as winning battles. A leader showing up at the front could be a game changer, signaling, "We're in this together." But was Stalin really that guy? Or were these trips just propaganda stunts? Let's dig into the evidence, starting with his first known visit to the front. Trip number 1. The Mazeisk defense line, August 1941. Our story kicks off in August 1941, when the Nazis were closing in on Moscow. The Soviets were racing to build the Mazeisk defense line, a network of bunkers, trenches, and fortifications to slow down the German advance. This was a do-or-die project, and Stalin wanted to see it for himself. According to Alexei Rybin, a major in the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and one of Stalin's bodyguards, the Soviet leader hit the road at night with Nikolai Bulganin, a top official, and a security detail. They headed to the Maloyaroslavets fortified area, a key part of the Mazeisk line that would later become famous for the heroic stand of the Podolsk cadets in October 1941. Picture this: it's pitch dark, the roads are muddy, and German planes are buzzing overhead, dropping bombs on anything that moves. Stalin's convoy rolls up, and he gets out to inspect the defenses. Rybin says Stalin didn't just stand around, he climbed into bunkers, checked the concrete fortifications, and grilled the engineers on their progress. This wasn't a photo op, the guy was hands-on. Then, at dawn, things got wild. As the convoy moved to the Volokholamsk fortified area, a dogfight broke out overhead. Soviet Yak-1 fighters were duking it out with German Messerschmitts. Rybin recalls Stalin watching the battle with a stone-cold expression, not flinching once. Talk about nerves of steel. This moment shows a side of Stalin you don't often hear about, a leader who didn't panic, even with bullets and bombs flying nearby. My take: why would Stalin, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, risk his life like this? He could have sent a general to check on things, but he went himself. I think it was about more than just inspecting bunkers. In 1941, The Soviet Union was on the brink, and soldiers needed to know their leader wasn't hiding. Stalin's presence was a morale booster, a way to say, "I'm here, and we're fighting back." It's the kind of move that could rally a battered army. Economically, the Mozhaevsk Line was a massive undertaking. Building it cost around 250 million rubles, roughly $4 billion in today's dollars, adjusted for inflation. That's a huge chunk of change for a country already stretched thin. According to Soviet archives, about 200,000 people, including local civilians, were drafted to dig trenches and pour concrete. Stalin's trip wasn't just about morale, it was about making sure this critical investment was paying off. If Moscow fell, the war was over. He knew it, and he wasn't taking chances. Trip number 2. Back to Mozhaevsk. Just a few days later, Stalin was back at the Mozhaevsk Line, this time riding in a Ford with a beefed-up NKVD escort. According to Ribin and other bodyguards, he wanted to double-check the progress and see the troops in action. Stalin was curious about everything: how the soldiers were dressed, what they were eating, and whether they had the grit to hold the line. The convoy stuck to backroads to avoid German scouts, winding through small villages where locals sometimes spotted the Soviet leader. In one village, the reaction was electric. Kids went nuts, shouting and waving, while adults cheered like they'd seen a rock star. Stalin's team even stopped to chat with villagers, and the great leader soaked it up. Later that day, he met with army commanders to get a read on the situation. The visit lasted just one day, but it left a mark. Soviet poet Nikolai Starshinov, who was serving nearby, wrote about how his regiment was lined up to greet Stalin, a moment that stuck with the troops. Economic angle. Let's zoom out for a second. The Soviet economy in 1941 was a mess. The USSR's GDP was around $359 billion in $1,990 per historian Mark Harrison, but the Nazi invasion had obliterated a quarter of the country's wealth. Factories were bombed, crops were burned, and millions of workers were either fighting or fleeing. The Mozhaevsk Line was a desperate bid to protect Moscow, but it came at a steep cost. Every shovel, every ton of concrete, every worker pulled from a factory was a strain on an already crippled system. Stalin's visit wasn't just about boosting morale, it was about making sure the money and manpower were being used right. He was micromanaging because he had to. The Soviets couldn't afford to waste a single resource. And when villagers cheered him on, it wasn't just blind loyalty, it was a sign that people still believed in the fight. That kind of public support was critical when every factory worker and farmer was being asked to give everything. Trip number 3. Dodging bombs with the Katyushas. Now, let's get to the most intense trip of all. On October 25, 1941, the Nazis captured the village of Skurminovo on the Volokholamsk Highway, creating a dangerous bulge in the Soviet lines. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the 16th Army, threw everything he had at the problem, including a battery of Katyusha rocket launchers, those terrifying weapons that could rain fire on enemy positions. Stalin, curious about these game-changing machines, decided to see them in action. His convoy set up near the Katyusha battery, and Stalin watched as the rockets lit up the sky. The Katyushas fired their salvos and bolted, per protocol, since the Germans were obsessed with hunting them down. Good thing, 2 minutes later, Nazi planes bombed the exact spot where the launchers had been. Stalin's group narrowly escaped disaster. But the drama didn't end there. On the way to Rokossovsky's headquarters, Stalin's armored Packard got stuck in the mud. Picture this: the Soviet leader, surrounded by bodyguards, in the middle of nowhere, with German planes overhead. The NKVD quickly moved him to another car, driving without headlights to avoid detection. The driver left behind with the Packard, a young lieutenant named Krivchenkov, was reportedly on the verge of tears, thinking he'd failed his mission. 5 minutes later, the Germans bombed the area, but Stalin was already safe. A tank was sent to retrieve the stranded Packard, and the day ended without a catastrophe. My take: this story is straight out of an action movie. Stalin, cool as ice, watching rockets blaze while bombs fall nearby. That's not the image most people have of him. But it makes you wonder, was he reckless or was this a calculated move? I lean toward the latter. Stalin knew the Katyushas were a big deal. Each one cost about 100,000 rubles, around $1.5 million today, and their psychological impact on the enemy was huge. A single salvo could wipe out a battalion. He wanted to see if these expensive weapons were worth it. This trip also shows how close the war was to Moscow. The front line was just 10 to 15 kilometers away, and Stalin was right there, risking it all. It's a reminder that leadership in wartime isn't just about strategy, it's about showing up when it counts. Stalin's gamble paid off, but it could have gone south fast. Trip number 4. Visiting the wounded. The fourth trip was quieter, but just as powerful. In mid-November 1941, Stalin visited a field hospital in the village of Lupikha, now Lenino, near Moscow. The hospital was set up in a simple wooden house, marked by a white flag with a red cross. The front line was just 5 miles away, so this was no safe zone. Stalin spent hours talking to wounded soldiers, asking about their experiences, what made the Germans strong, and where they were weak. He wasn't just making small talk, he was gathering intel straight from the source. According to Wikipedia and accounts from bodyguards like Ribbon, Stalin's visit left a deep impression. The soldiers saw their leader not as a distant figure, but as someone who cared enough to show up. He left as darkness fell, slipping back to Moscow without incident. Economic and social context. Field hospitals in 1941 were a grim sight. Historian Elena Senyavskaya notes that about 70% of wounded Soviet soldiers returned to the fight, but it came at a cost. Hospitals were often housed in makeshift buildings, short on medicine, bandages, and even food. Each wounded soldier got about 1.5 rubles a day for meals, roughly $25 in today's money. That bought you bread and thin soup, if you were lucky. Medics worked miracles with almost nothing. Stalin's visit wasn't just about boosting morale, it was a signal to the medical system to keep pushing. The Soviet Union couldn't afford to lose soldiers permanently, and every man who recovered was a victory. Word of Stalin's visit spread, giving civilians and soldiers alike a sense that their sacrifices mattered. In a war where hope was in short supply, that was huge. Why these trips matter so? What's the big deal about Stalin's frontline visits? First off, they debunked the idea that he was a coward hiding in a bunker. He didn't fight in the trenches, but he put himself in harm's way close to enemy lines, under threat of bombs and bullets. That's not nothing for a guy running a country under siege. Second, these trips were a propaganda goldmine. In 1941, the Soviet Union was staring down the barrel of defeat. Soldiers were retreating, cities were burning, and despair was creeping in. Stalin showing up at the front was like a shot of adrenaline. It said, "We're not giving up, and neither should you." Even if the visits were carefully staged, they worked. Soldiers and civilians rallied around the idea that their leader was in the fight with them. Finally, these trips humanized Stalin, at least a little. He's often portrayed as a cold, calculating dictator, but here we see a guy talking to wounded soldiers, inspecting bunkers, and dodging bombs. It doesn't erase his darker actions, but it adds depth to the story. He wasn't just a name in a history book, he was a person navigating a nightmare. Economic deep dive. The cost of war. To really get the stakes, let's talk numbers. In 1941, the Soviet Union spent about 50% of its budget on the war, roughly 100 billion rubles, or $1.5 trillion in today's dollars, per Mark Harrison. That's a staggering amount for a country that had lost a quarter of its wealth to the Nazis. Factories were gone, farmland was occupied, and the labor force was decimated. By late 1941, the Red Army had mobilized 5 million men, leaving women, teenagers, and the elderly to keep the economy running. By 1942, women made up 60% of factory workers, up from 40% in 1941, according to Soviet records. Every decision Stalin made, including these trips, was tied to this economic reality. The Mozaisk line, the Katyushas, the hospitals, all were critical investments that had to work. His visits were a way to check on those investments while showing the country he was still in charge. It was leadership under pressure, with no room for error. Stalin's trips to the front in 1941 are a hidden gem of history, a story of risk, leadership, and survival in the face of overwhelming odds. They show a side of Stalin that doesn't fit the usual narrative, a leader who whatever his flaws, wasn't afraid to get close to the action. These moments didn't win the war on their own, but they helped keep the Soviet Union in the fight when everything seemed lost. I hope this deep dive got you thinking. History isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people, their choices, and the stakes they faced. Let's keep exploring these stories together. Subscribe to the channel, drop your comments below, and let me know what you think. Did Stalin's trips surprise you? Do you see them as genuine leadership or just a publicity stunt? Share your thoughts, hit that like button, and let's keep the conversation going. See you in the next video. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comments. This was a wild ride through one of history's most intense moments, and I poured my heart into making it engaging for you. What did you think of Stalin's frontline visits? Let's talk about it below, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic history deep dives. Your support keeps this channel going, so hit that button and join the journey.